Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the Association for Research in Personality's 7th annual conference. The theme of this year's conference is Reconciling Our Past, Imagining Our Future towards a more inclusive personality science. We're so glad that so many of you have joined us today. We'll have a more extensive introduction to the goals of the conference in a later session, but I wanted to kick off our discussion of one of the 3 invited symposia that we organized for this conference. The theme was how open is personality psychology to researchers from marginalized communities. We are so grateful that Laura King and Jordan Booker from the University of Missouri organized the symposium. We're really glad that members of their set of talks are here to discuss what are called this question with us. So without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to Laura and Jordan.
Okay, wow, thank you. I'm so excited to see so many people here. I'm also a little surprised. That's awesome. So before we get started, I did want to thank again in this sort of in-person moment, the speakers that contributed to our symposium. I thought that it was just amazing and it was super gratifying on so many levels. I also want to thank Aranda and Joanne because I honestly think that this is one of the most important problems. As I said, if you watch my little video, one of the most important problems we're facing in personality psychology. And many universities, like my university, are really starting to emphasize the importance of considerations of diversity in student training. And this last spring was the first time I really tried to incorporate more diverse issues and especially race in my intro to personality class. And it was one of the most challenging experiences I've ever had. And so I was pretty excited to be a part of this symposium. Jordan, do you want to say anything?
There's not a ton else to add. I echo a lot of Laura's sentiments here. I really appreciate all of the effort going into making this a possibility, thanking the organizers, thanking all the speakers for their time, their dedication, their insights, and really excited to get to chat with all of you. I think this is a wide-ranging, far-reaching, and long overdue conversation for our field, for many of our departments and our university communities. And I'm hopeful that some of the conversations today will be constructive for us, thinking both pretty locally, regionally, but also thinking of ways that there can be some good synergy for some wide-ranging impacts where we can really start seeing some ongoing improvements for personality science.
So I'm happy to have questions from everybody to anyone. Beverly, I don't think is here yet, but all of our other speakers are here. Or I have some questions if people feel shy, as you know, I'm rarely feel shy. And so I'm happy to start things off. I will. Let's see. So I have a question for Olivia, Dr. Atherton, about your remarkable experiences with publishing research from diverse communities in our journals. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about weathering those storms. Like, I actually know that there are people who, for example, have tried to do research on gender. When they try to publish it, got this really negative feedback and just said, forget it, and switched areas. What do you think accounts for your endurance?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think I have 2 responses. One is that a lot of the comments that I've received on my work with the CFP, the California Families Project, which is that longitudinal study of Mexican origin families. I think one thing that basically helped me to endure through all of that is I'm not from an identity that is harmed specifically by those comments. So I am not Mexican origin myself. I am a white woman. And so in a lot of ways, I can read those comments and I know that they're problematic and harmful. but it doesn't carry the same weight, I think, that it would if I held a different identity that I shared more with this particular population. And so in many ways, I can take a more objective, I guess, kind of perspective when I read these comments and be like, this is super problematic. How can I respond to these comments in a way that will better the field, I guess? And then with respect to the second half of the comments that I talked about in my talk, that were on the opinion piece, I would say that those affected me quite a bit more because I think they were a lot more general about diversity and generalizability. And I have to say that I wasn't sure if I wanted to respond to those comments. And I will say that I had 24 wonderful co-authors who pushed me and helped me craft responses that everyone was happy with. Or most people were happy with, I should say. And so I think I was motivated. I had to take a couple days off, I will say, after reading some of those comments. But I would say that my community is really what helped me to weather those things. And I feel very fortunate for that.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most remarkable and horrifying things I've ever read. And I've gotten some very personally insulting reviews, but nothing like that. That was just awful. I'm so glad you decided to share those experiences with us. All right, I have a question for Dr. Harrell. Are you there, Jules?
I am here, yes. I'm mobile but present.
Okay. I hope I can ask you a question without you getting in a car accident, but I wanted to ask, I mean, I really, I so enjoyed your talk and I was so, just really, I learned so much and I was gratified because I'd done a lot of reading about Black psychology and personality and Afrocentric approaches to personality, like I said, when I was preparing my class. And I wonder if you could just talk about how do you see these two tracks of personality psychology? Are they separate? Do they have to remain separate? I mean, it's so bizarre for me as a white woman to be teaching my class about Afrocentric approaches to personality psychology. But that, I guess that kind of thing has to happen if students are going to be exposed to those ideas and we don't have many faculty of color who are personality psychologists teaching the course. Do you think that there's should these paths unite? Should they stay separate? What are your thoughts on that?
I think what's going to happen is that down the road, there will be sort of a grand theory that we'll be talking about. We may not be at that point yet. I know that first, and we're talking now specifically more along the lines of those what we call constructionistic Black psychologists. Those are sort of about kind of pulling together a new framework for looking at human beings. You know, that first generation, clearly you would say, okay, these fields are quite separate. But then you look at that second generation, the Cheryl Grills, some of these other individuals that are coming on the scene now, even Everett Bruce Bynum. You see that it's going to merge, I think, eventually. But I think what you don't want to do is do it artificially. You know, you want it to sort of be like an organic kind of merging of those two fields as they mature and develop.
One of the things you talked about in your talk was the sort of this challenge of I mean, I guess it's like a pipeline issue about encouraging students to pursue personality psychology while at the same time the mentors don't look like them or the community doesn't look like them, and sort of which will come first, right? And how do we solve that problem? Do you have any ideas about how we solve that problem?
You know, I think what we really have to consider now is that we've had, and I sort of marked it from that 67 speech that Dr. King gave at SPICI, the Society for Psychological Studies of Social Issues. That from that point forward, just as an artificial demarcation line, a lot of work has been done that's out there, published, and available to students. And I think if we broaden the perspective that we take in our courses, then students will be sort of, their imagination will be captured that maybe personality psychology is something that speaks to me, you know. So you have, and I even took it back a little further to Frantz Fanon critiquing Freud and critiquing Jung a little bit as a medical student. Some of his earliest book, that Black Skin, White Mask book, he does take these people, to task in terms of understanding the colonized individual. Well, if you sort of open the course up at that point, that when the student, even the student may not see anybody that looks like them in the teaching mode, but they certainly heard about individuals that look like them in that, what was being taught. And then of course they can pursue it at a much deeper level. But there's a lot of work out there now. I mentioned in the talk, Reginald Jones, and edited 20 books as a professor at Berkeley. And I said he didn't need to do that. He had plenty on his plate. But he really made that a life's work. And a lot of that stuff is really, it stands the test of time and can be read. So I think
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and I personally wish that my own training included that kind of exposure, especially in graduate school, in which I pretty much had blinders on, and if something wasn't in JPSP, it just didn't seem to speak to me. So I've learned a lot since then. So I appreciate that point.
And if I could piggyback on that a little bit and make a connection with Dr. Harris's talk. Oh. I think we missed the latter part of that, Dr. Harrell.
I missed that.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna piggyback off of your answer and make a connection to Dr. Harris's talk. Because Dr. Harrell, you talk really nicely about some of the importance thinking of our pedagogy, thinking of our teaching, about how we need to do a better job of making sure that this work, even if it's not in some of the quote unquote mainstream text courses that we've been familiar with, that we do a better job of really reaching back, looking around at the multiple contributions of more authors, more scholars representing more backgrounds. And that's one major leg that I think would be really beneficial for our field, getting more students seeing the potential, seeing ways that they can belong, they can make a contribution in personality science. Dr. Harris, you also brought up some really nice points, thinking about things like mentoring, thinking of things like community change in our departments, ways that we can be very purposeful, very self-reflective in what's going well and what's not going well in our various departments. Can you speak a little bit, again, for the group, just on some of the things that really stand out to you, or things that you've heard from students or colleagues that might seem a bit more promising in really trying to encourage and maintain more students representing more backgrounds, feeling like they belong in our scientific communities, feeling like they are getting the training, the preparation, the readiness to step into things like graduate programs, to persevere in their programs. Can you just share a little bit on your insights again with that?
Yeah, so I think back to when I was a grad student and I attended CISP, I call it grad student summer camp, but it's like the Summer Institute for Personality and Social Psychology, somehow those words are put together. But basically, it's grad student summer camp. You're away for 2 weeks in a new city with a bunch of different grad students, and I met a bunch of people there. And then at the next SPSP was talking to some of the other Black grad students that I met at CISP. And whenever people would introduce me to someone, they were like, she's a personality psychologist. They had never, I was a unicorn. And I was just really struck by that. And I think part of it was that I was a Black personality psychologist, which was one, we've never met personality people, and you're Black and you're over there, what's happening? So I think it was a combination. And I think that also just really highlighted to me, how little exposure so many people have to personality as a discipline. Given the fact that we're all at this conference, we're probably all at universities where there are personality faculty, there's something of a personality program, but that's not a lot of places. And I think that I think that makes us have to like work a little harder if we're wanting to widen our cast a wider net and like recruit people kind of into this discipline, because just like if they haven't heard of it, like they don't know that that's a thing that they could do. So I think a lot of the kind of impetus is going to have to be like on us to like move towards students, and not wait for students to come to us. I think is my the main thing I have to say about that. Yeah.
How did you end up in personality, Kelsey?
Yeah, how did I get here? So I was a very eager undergrad and started working in a lab when I was a sophomore. And in that time in the lab, I was doing a project on like friendship reciprocity, and like in high school students, and seeing like, oh, a bunch of high school students are like really bad at knowing who their friends are, but some of them are really good. Like that sounds like an individual difference. And kind of from there, I was doing research and trying to figure out like, oh, I'm like interested in this idea of like how what you're like can influence your social outcomes. And like I went to University of North Carolina, like they don't have a personality program. So that was like me doing my own digging. But again, I'll point out, and this goes back to what Dr. Harrell was saying, when I was looking at graduate programs, like I would click around and I would be like, oh, great, a Black faculty member. And inevitably they would be studying stereotyping and prejudice, just about. So, or culture. And like that wasn't my interest. So I kind of knew that if I was going to go into personality, like I would likely not have a mentor who matched my racial background. So I think it was helpful. Like I knew what I was interested in, so I was kind of okay with that. But I can see for students, if they're just trying to figure out, if they're still in the figuring out what they want to do phase, that could be a deterrent.
Yeah, I'm so glad you stuck it out. So I want to welcome Dr. Beverly Vandiver, who is with us now, one of our speakers. I do have a question. Well, I kind of have two questions for you, Beverly, and I hope that neither one of them is surprising or hard to answer. The first one is, you are interested in assessment. You're clearly a researcher. There are many personality psychologists who are counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, developmental psychologists, and you're not a personality psychologist.
Nope.
Did you think about it ever? Or how is it that you're not a personality psychologist, as someone who's deeply interested in individual differences and assessment?
That's a really good question. I think I tell people I'm an accidental researcher and a professor, because I came, as you would see my presentation, from the foothills of Appalachia, where advanced education was not the thing that anybody thought about. My parents had no more than an 8th grade education. I was in a high school of graduating class of 30. Most of them did not go to college. They got married sometimes during school, had babies. And so the expectation of going to college was pretty high in my family, but what did that mean? And psychology, I started out as an experimental psychology working with rats. And to get into graduate school, someone says, what do you want to do? Continue to work with animals or people? I said, let me try people. So that moved me into clinical psychology, but I was first focused on the helping profession. And the movement from clinical to counseling psychology occurred because I was still very much interested in racial, ethnic, and cultural issues. And that was not on the radar of many clinical psychologists. One of the few, unless I went through anthropology or sociology in psychology, the place where race and ethnicity was centered was either in social psychology or in counseling. And since I wanted to practice, I moved toward counseling psychology. And then once I got to doctoral school, I also had the opportunity to encounter social. So I had a cognate in social psychology. So I didn't think about personality because I don't think at the time that personality centered or had much of a center on race and ethnicity. It had broad scope regarding personality, and I was fascinated by the general aspects of the field, but it wasn't centered on race. And so I started out being centered on race and ethnicity, and counseling psychology gave me that home to think about it. And you're right, I am also a very unusual counseling psychologist because I'm a methodologist and I like assessment. I like scaling, but I'm interested in that because it made me take a step back to think about if ethnic and racial issues were considered a marginalized aspect because they didn't give it validity. How do you give it validity? Measure it, and measure it well. And so that's what directed my attention. And so, yes, I'm interested in individual differences. I probably border on personality in the sense that I'm looking at scopes of kind of characteristics of people, but they're not necessarily traits per se. But so I probably flipped on that line here and there, but it wasn't an area that I think. And so the question is, has personality at this point broadened its scope where it is centering culture and ethnicity? You know, it's always recognized situational or traits, but it seems very global. It seems very abstract. I haven't really seen that context is such a, or situation, such a broad term that it's never been specified in ways that says, because he'll do cross-cultural, but I've not seen it say, yeah, we're going to look at Black folks.
Right.
We're going
I mean,
to look
that's
at
the thing.
Latinx
I
folks.
agree. It has been this thing that drives me crazy is that personality psychologists, this is being taped, personality psychologists, in my opinion, would be more interested in collecting data in Japan, in another country, you know, China,
Yeah.
let's go to wherever, than diverse populations in the United States. Yeah. And I mean, I can say, I don't know why that is, but I might know why that is. My other question for you, and you want to be careful how you answer this because there's all these personality psychologists listening. So
Sure.
You are the editor of the Journal of Black Psychology.
Yes.
And I'm just curious about, would you see personality psychology that's centered Black people as something viable to publish in your journal?
Absolutely. So I don't have to even worry about y'all coming after me because I think that any area of psychology is welcome in the Journal of Black Psychology. I was just, I apologize for being late, but the Division 45 and APA is having their conference at the same time. And so I was on another symposium, but yesterday we were talking about editors of ethnic journals. And what I tell them is that we will consider anything of the scope based upon the psychological experience of Blacks. And we don't do too many comparative studies. And because that has been the history of trying to legitimize the psychological experience of Blacks. We don't need that legitimacy. The being Black in itself is a legitimate foci or a focus of the psychological experience. So we take measurement pieces, personality, educational pieces. We right now are promoting a special issue on Black women's body image, and it could come from any angle that you're talking about. We have another one that would fit probably if people want to take it from a personality perspective, the psychology of Black activism. That's another special issue we've been working on. And most recently, I've been working on, haven't put it out there yet, I want to do one on whiteness. And, from Black psychology perspective, because a lot of times, again, people feel like they can be an expert about racial issues regardless of ethnicity. And so a lot of white people white psychologists write about it, as they should. But then I think, you want to flip the script sometimes and look at some of the thoughts or research that's centering from a Black lens. But we would take any piece that has the focus on the psychology of the Black experience. So yes, we'd welcome personality people. So think about us, center your studies on Black folks, nothing comparative, and write it well, because I'm a stickler, and have it well designed. I'll definitely think about it. And I love experimental design. So that if that's the scope, because a lot of times people think that it has to be survey, but I love, experimental designs or anything of that nature. I'm open.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's what I'm so excited that you were able to say those things to this group of personality psychologists. It's just very exciting and interesting, and that's fantastic.
I have a question for the group, for people to think about, because again, I always love to flip the script. What does the group, oh yes, Joanne, that's right. So that the O face, yeah, you should go, oh my goodness. What do people think is the reason that this field has not embraced the domestic issues or the individual differences of personality of people of color? What has held the field back with it being the 21st century? And what do you need to do about it? Or do you want to do anything about it?
So what are some of the big barriers that we're still seeing for the field? Is there anything that's been standing out to folks, whether you're author or someone designing your studies, trying to recruit participants, someone who's an action editor, someone who's been a reviewer on multiple submissions and seen some potential or seen some concerns? What have been some of the things that have stood out as opportunities, and some of the things that have stood out as some clear barriers to you, from kind of whatever way you're coming in from the field? Jen, I think you had your hand up first.
I got my video, but not my muting. Hi, folks. I'm Jen Lodi-Smith. I'm on the board of ARP, and I'm a professor at Canisius College. I think one of the things that I see from my lens is I do a lot of archival work, and really struggling with the fact that one of the primary studies that I work with was drawn from the University of Rochester undergraduate population in the 1960s. And they were really white and really upper class. And I can't even, when I post my data on OSF, I think I've got 4 participants of color. And so I can't include race in my databases because it's too revealing of who folks are. And so I know one of the things that's a really important initiative that we are working on, probably some of the folks on this call, is working towards a more representative sample that would be complementary to that. But it's because this project has a lot of really interesting longitudinal data about Ericksonian ideas, we can't answer a lot of the questions that we have about Ericksonian development from any lens other than our upper middle class white samples. And so from, a lot of us in this room, as I look around, are developmentalists as well as personality psychologists. And so I think that's where we need to look towards our past to think about how we can do better in our samples as we start to collect new data.
Thank you.
Joanne?
Hey, thank you, Beverly, for asking that question. This is just, 2 things just off the top of my head, but I'm wondering, so in my own experience, it's kind of grappling with, so I'm a personality development person, I guess, and, love data analysis, love thinking about normative trajectories, love thinking about individual variability around that. But when we forget to be specific about what normative means, right, in the context of our samples. And I think when we talk about normative, we might mix it up with what's healthy, what we think is healthy and adaptive. And these are kind of in the names of our constructs, right? So if I think about, like, there have been really interesting questions that my undergrads have asked me about racial differences on neuroticism, for example, right? That can get really iffy, right? Like if you're saying, oh, well, like Asian people or whatever, right? Like any group difference on negative emotionality, what does that mean? And so I think I get stuck there sometimes. And I think also just kind of, I'm somebody who kind of was really into having huge samples of data, and I still love that stuff for sure. But just kind of thinking of what is the value of looking at a small group and not having a comparative sample. So exactly what you're saying, Beverly. So those are just some, like, a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. Thank you for asking that question.
Well, I think there's a couple things to think about, because I appreciate people sharing, because depending on the data or the focus, it can be trying. But I think that when you're talking about students, naturally ask about comparative stuff, because when I was a student, that was my focus, was comparative. And then at some point I started to see the value that before one can compare, one need to be able to understand interculturally the heterogeneity. And that's what moved me to just focus on a group. But I would say that just as I think Jen was talking about the difficulty of her sample, the assumption is that to focus on a ethnic minority population is going to be more difficult. And it isn't. It is just about strategy. I was at Penn State, and Penn State is a pretty majority white campus with a handful of Black students at the time I was there, between 1995 and 2012. And my research, I need large data. And so my goal was to at least 300 of above. And people were amazed that I was able to get that number. And in fact, I did a retest study over 6 weeks and had an 88% return rate. So it's possible to do that. I mean, I was at Western Michigan and got a sample size of over 400 African Americans. It just requires that you think strategy and get out of the mindset that it's not possible. You just have got to think about what those strategies are. And I just tell people that you begin to have to broaden your thinking regarding strategies. Because the minute you say, well, this population is too small to study, then it begins to be too small to study. And so mindsets regarding doing research with race, even within personality, and that it sort of keeps it marginalized versus bringing it to the center. And what I tell people to think about, what has it taken for you to do the research you want to do that most people would think of as a niche? And how did you achieve that? And if you crosswalk that thinking over to the racial side, it gets to be interesting. So it's nothing that's really different or unique. It's just that there's the way race and other diversity has been framed in this country makes it come off as a barrier too difficult to overcome. And I just tell people, first start thinking as if it's the everyday and the normative versus thinking it's the unusual. And it changes how you begin to approach the process of centering part of your research on race and ethnicity. But it's the latter the former we've been used to. If that makes sense.
Excellent. I'm just keeping an eye on our time and just want to open up the floor again in case there are some questions from those in our audience. If there's anything that you all would like to discuss specifically or any questions you might have for us, we'd love to try to answer those now or get a discussion going.
I would just really quickly like to add on this in terms of getting the research going, the notion of interdisciplinarity on this, that there are people on your campuses that are in contact with the African American or the Native American or the Hispanic community. And you have to sometimes reach out to them, not only for the purpose of finding participants, but also for the purpose of just sort of broadening perspective. So I think that sometimes those individuals can be very, very helpful in getting the thing started.
Absolutely.
No hands are up. I will. I do want to take a crack at Beverly's hard question. Oh, now Jen and Aranda both have the, but I'm still going to try to give an answer, because I think that often, at least in my opinion, personality psychologists sometimes attribute the lack of diversity in the field to the idea that students aren't interested in personality psychology because we focus on the person, and because since the 60s, we have been in some ways in opposition to, like, their personality psychologists aren't in SPICY, are they? That we see, like, well, they want to go, they don't want to study personality. They're interested in prejudice and stereotyping. And so they're going to go to social psychologists. And I think that when I hear that, I always think about the fact that people say the same thing about STEM and physics. They say that about astronomy. They say that about engineering, that is just garbage. That if we think of students of color as people just like us, then we're fascinated by personality. Who wouldn't be? It's an amazing, complex, interesting question. And if we just sort of give up on that idea that those students who could grow up to be Kelsey, right, are going to be fascinated by individual differences, because they are fascinating. That it isn't about, like, oh, you know, it's too quantitative. People aren't interested. No, they're freaking interested. We need to remember that they give them a chance to be interested, right? We need to present our work in a way that they can be excited by it. And I think that both Dr. Harrell and Dr. Vandiver and Dr. Harris have talked about ways to do that. And Dr. Booker, in his marvelous talk that he got down on time in a miraculous way, y'all, have all given us ideas about ways to do that, and really the necessity of doing it. Like, we can't be a colorblind field. You can't look out at your students in your class and you see these students and look at them with colorblind eyes. So you don't say to the African-American students sitting in front of you, nodding and engaged, hey, you seem like you're interested in this. You want to come to my lab meeting and hang out. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to talk to people and open up that conversation about personality to students. You don't have to be colorblind. You're allowed to see them. And just think about the promise that they could bring to our field. Because there's so many questions we're not asking, because we're a bunch of white people. We didn't even think of these questions, right? Gosh, we need these diverse voices. Our field is like, I honestly feel that, like, as I said in my 5-minute spiel, our field this is way more difficult than the person situation debate. We need to look at ourselves. We missed the 60s because we were worrying about Walter Mischel and fighting against the situationist attack. And there were lots of things that happened in 1968, not just the publication of Personality and Assessment.
There were a couple of people had their hands up before.
Miranda, did you still have a question?
I did have a question, and I mean, I don't want to derail this conversation because it was a question I had for Olivia for her talk. So if no one else wants to follow up on what Laura said, I will ask the question, but just to make sure. Okay, so anyways, so I had a thought about your last set of examples from the paper, your personality science paper that you were discussing. And one, I can't speak for the motives of the reviewer, right? And I don't know whether this is a view that's widely held, but one worry that I had, right, thinking about that person's response was that, people might think, well, as a field, as personality psychologists, we really care about like methodological rigor and like, thinking deeply about methods and doing the best science we can. And that's what we do, right? And we, and yes, there are these like bigger, like structural problems and there's all these inequality in society, but that's not what we do. And that I got the sense that was a bit of the subtext that was going on. And I don't know, I can't speak for this person, but I feel like there's a very worrying default stance for someone to take, right? That, as personality scientists, we know we're good at X, right? This is why we came up pretty well in the what I call replication crisis, right? And that's what we do. And it seems that in order for us to make like the type of progress that Laura was talking about, we need to sort of hold multiple truths simultaneously, right? That yes, as a field, we do have, very, very strong what I call skills, and we have tools that we use that really sort of make our science maybe more robust in ways that maybe other sub areas aren't, right? But maybe there's also a blind spot, right? Because arguably, unlike social psychology, right? Personality psychologists in the past maybe didn't go into the field to make the world a better place, right? I mean, that was the one draw that social psychologists had. You want to make the world a better place? This is what you study. And I feel like we as a field haven't had the chance to reflect on that, right? There's maybe the basic science question that drives our research, but also what is the point of what we're doing question that maybe we haven't reflected on enough.
Yeah, thanks so much for your thoughts on that, Aranda. Yeah, I think you raise a lot of interesting points. One of which I would also like to elaborate on a little bit further, which is like this idea of like, what is rigorous science, right? So I think that has a lot of like issues packed into it. So aside from like, the blatant racism of the comment, there is this idea that like there is some scientific method that is more rigorous than other scientific methods. And, in personality psychology, with a lot of the people, sitting in this room, we are very heavily focused on quantitative approaches, longitudinal data, ESM data, all these other quantitative tools to answer our questions. But I think that one way we could also become more inclusive is taking a broader approach to what we consider to be rigorous personality science. So that would be things like, how many people are doing qualitative research? Like we shouldn't have this hierarchical system of thinking that like certain research is more rigorous than other research, that by including more diverse methods into our science, we're only going to become better. And so, thinking about these emic-etic approaches that Dr. Vandiver talked about, thinking about qualitative studies and how we can marry qualitative studies with quantitative studies and so forth. So that was just something I thought about while you were talking, but I really appreciate your comments on this.
I want to stir the pot and then we'll be ended and then everybody's going to be upset with me, but I can live with that. And that is, there's a fine walk to cross to do with this, because the minute you were talking to him about, Olivia, I think your name is, about rigorous research and how it can come as a buzzword, the minute you shift over to qualitative, as if to broaden diversity, is equally offensive, because of the fact that it implies that you can't really do good cultural work unless it moves into qualitative. And so you got to be careful from that. I know you didn't mean that, but that's part of the problem, because the message is being sent, only white people can do really rigorous quantitative research, and that's why I became a research methodologist, because as someone said, I did not want to get labeled as a weak sister, and I'm not a weak sister, but I think it happens. And so there's a fine line to walk here in terms of, as you invite people in, that you're inviting people in for the right reason and not the wrong reasons. And the thing that's going to be the right reason about inviting anybody regarding culture is whether you truly want the field of personality to reflect the actual reality about personality. And if you want that, diversify. If you don't care and you only want to study white people that are college students and some outside the field, continue to do what you want to do. But it will at some point narrow down where you're only going to be this much relevant out of the population. So I challenge people to think about your comfort level in broadening so that it makes the field more interesting, whether you do quantitative or qualitative. If you don't want the field to be broadened, keep doing what you're doing. But at some point, you're going to engage in a crisis of thought, a crisis in lens, development. It's going to be there when you look around and this is the majority of people of color. And it may not be African Americans. It could be probably is going to be a Latin. And so what are we going to do then? And so I tell people diversify for the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons. And that you can engage students of color into quantitative, rigorous research, if that is your focus. Because I will tell you, I don't do qualitative. So students come to me to be advised. I tell them, you have to remember, we're doing quantitative research and you're going to have to hop because I don't play. And so the expectations can be there, but you got to be careful that you expand the kinds of methodology because you think it'll expand your notion of learning. But qualitative research just isn't just for ethnic research. And so you have to be very careful not to get into that stereotype. So that's all I want to say, and hope I didn't offend anybody. But if you want to publish in the Journal of Black Psychology, collect some data on Black folks, feel free to submit. I'd be happy to take a look at it.
Awesome. Thank you both for your thoughts there. That was really helpful and very constructive conversation, dialogue, I thought.
Yeah.
So we are at time. I want to thank Laura and John again. Thank you so much for putting such a fantastic set of talks together. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. So we do have a packed agenda for the rest of today. So this is our 1 15-minute break coming up. So what we'll do is that we'll reconvene in a little over 12 minutes at the Gather Town link. I have put the link in the chat just in case you want quick access to it. I had no experience with Gather Town until last week. It's a blast. And we have a great set of posters. We can also continue this discussion on the platform. So we'll break now for 12 minutes and we'll see you at the poster session at 7 o'clock Eastern. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you again to our speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you all for the opportunity.
Fantastic.